Good morning, everyone. My name is Kwong. I'm an assistant professor of English here, and I'm excited to be moderating our first panel on teaching with science fiction collections. Being an instructor of science fiction here myself, I've benefited tremendously from Jason's expertise kind of as the curator of this collection, so I'm looking forward to having a great conversation going with how to bring these literally analog texts to life. This is a paper presentation, so each presenter will have up to 20 minutes to read their paper. So after both presenters have read their papers, I will open up the floor to questions and answers. If you could please hold questions until after all papers have been read, and not interrupt presenters while they're reading, that would be much appreciated. Our first presenter is Professor Ellis. He is an assistant professor of English at City Tech and a co-director of Open Lab, the open source online space to learn, work, and share. He holds a PhD in English from Kent State University, an MA in Science Fiction Studies from the University of Liverpool, and a BS in Science, Technology, and Culture from Georgia Tech. He co-authored with Lisa Yazek the chapter on science fiction in the Cambridge Companion, the Literature and the Post-Human, co-edited with Sean Scanlon, the special issue of New American Notes Online on Star Wars The Force Awakens, and most recently appeared on Star Talk Radio with Neil deGrasse Tyson to discuss the connection between science fiction and culture. So please give a warm welcome to Jason.
So in this session, Zach and I wanted to talk about some of the pedagogically focused work that's taking place in and around the City Tech Science Fiction Collection, which kickstarted our first symposium back in 2016. In my part, I'll introduce the collection and talk very briefly about some of its pedagogical uses at City Tech. At the beginning of 2016, an anonymous donor in California reached out to my former colleague Alan Lovegreen about finding a home for their 600 linear foot collection of science fiction magazines, anthologies, novels, and scholarship. Alan asked me to collaborate with him on the proposal, and then we began seeking support from the administration and the library. And eventually we were able to get the City Tech Foundation to fund the move of that collection from California to Brooklyn with a $5,000 grant. Now, due to how lean the City Tech the City Tech ship is run, it was all hands on deck to move, store, shelve, and catalog the collection. Alan flew out to California to supervise shipping. When the 160 box of books arrived in Brooklyn, we found temporary storage in our shared office spaces, and then over several months began moving and shelving the materials in the library's archives. After helping with shelving the collection, Alan had to move back to California for family reasons. He now teaches at Orange Coast College and visits us when he can. Over the years since the acquisition, I led an effort to build a finding aid while cataloging the contents of the collection. Colleagues including Lavelle Porter, Lucas Kwong, Laura Westengard, and student Jessica Roman all chipped in to complete the finding aid for everything that's currently shelved. It only took us 3 years to do it. There's a little more work to do in the collection. Aaron Barlow donated a huge cache of Philip K. Dick novels, collections, and scholarship, and there are 7 more boxes of horror and mystery magazines to shelve and catalog. If there's one thing that I've learned from the acquisition is that it takes time and patience. To celebrate the acquisition to coordinate and share the science fiction related work that we do at City Tech, including the collection, I created this site on Open Lab, City Tech's homegrown open source online place to learn, work, and share. It's easy to find with a Google search just for science fiction and City Tech. To celebrate the acquisition of the collection, we began hosting an annual science fiction symposium. Mary Nihilus, Jill Belay, and I organized the first in late fall 2016. Thanks to Lavelle Porter, Samuel R. Delaney gave our keynote at the second symposium in fall 2017. Folding in more interdisciplinary discussions, we held the third symposium in fall 2018. Now we partnered with Analog Science Fiction and Fact for our fourth symposium to celebrate one of the cornerstones of the collection, Analog SF's 90th anniversary. Now, connected, you might recognize some of the folks up there. Connected to each symposium is a public exhibit of posters, cover art, and artifacts from the collection in the City Tech Library. Here you can see part of this year's exhibit, which spans 3 smaller displays in addition to this one. Analog editor Trevor Kashi, managing editor in Hockaday, helped install this year's exhibit. Now, since inaugurating the City Tech Science Fiction Collection, we opened the doors to researchers and students. Originally with the help of librarian Keith Mikowski and now with collections management librarian Wynette Clyde, we've hosted a few researchers using collection materials in their work. The librarians and I form a team who pull materials from the collection for researchers and manage the adjacent classroom where scholars may read. In addition to the potential for learning from the annual symposium and library exhibits, we invite classes to visit and use collection materials in lectures and assignments. In December 2016, Jill Belai's science fiction class was the first class to visit and use the collection as part of a class discussion on science fiction magazine publishing culture. Students were able to hold, read, and discuss the magazines with one another. This was something new to most of the students. In fact, one student exclaimed, "This is a magazine?" I mean, they hadn't held or seen something like this before. It was totally new to them. Then, on February 7th, 2019, Lavelle Porter brought students from his 2 sections of Introduction to Literature 1 Fiction to the collection. He tells us that, quote, librarian Wynette Clyde facilitated our session and helped us with retrieving material. Among the texts that my class read and discussed this semester were Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Samuel R. Delaney's essay, Racism in Science Fiction. Students had already done some research by looking up critical articles about Octavia Butler and the Parable of the Sower in various journals, including SF journals such as Extrapolation and Science Fiction Studies. Using the collection's finding aid, we were able to locate print copies of these journals containing the articles that students had found online and summarized. This was a meaningful way for students to experience print material and see the physical origins of journals that are archived in digital platforms like JSTOR. Walking through the archive, students were able to see old paperbacks of science fiction novels and all of the other wonderful material available in the collection. This experience helped students to think about the material aspects of fiction publishing and expand their knowledge of science fiction as a popular genre of fiction writing, end quote. Then Lucas Kwong has brought several of his classes to the collection. Last month, Lucas arranged a visit for his Gothic literature and visual culture class, for which I pulled some issues of our unshelved Elderly Queen and Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine issues for them to explore. In 2018 and 2019, Lucas brought his science fiction classes to the collection as part of a larger assignment, which he says, quote, it involves comparing and contrasting one of the texts we discussed this semester with a text of their choice. I'm encouraging them to think of the archive as both a source of creative inspiration, they will have to write a short story as part of the assignment, and a means of contextualizing their analysis in the light of sci-fi's history, end quote. Finally, as a fellow in the NEH-funded project, The Cultural History of Digital Technology, directed by Ann Leonard and co-directed by Sandra Chang, Satyan Singh, and Peter Spillane, I created 4 teaching modules that paired readings from the collection with hands-on learning exercises that use Wolfram Mathematica and Maple. For example, I paired Robert Heinlein's And He Built a Crooked House in Astounding Science Fiction, February 1941, which is about a house that collapses in on itself during an earthquake to create a 4-dimensional cube or tesseract, with activities in Mathematica that teach topological concepts related to surfaces and dimensions. The story primes students to think about higher dimensional objects before learning the math behind them and the digital tools that we can use to visualize and manipulate them. This marks the 4th year of the City Tech Science Fiction Collection, and in that short time, we've done many good things because of and with the collection. If I'm to pull a Ralph 124C41 plus, I foresee many more learning opportunities built on the astounding shared resource that we have here, the City Tech Science Fiction Collection. Thank you.
So next we have Zachary Lloyd. Zachary has completed an MA in philosophy from the New School for Social Research and is currently a PhD student in comparative literature at CUNY Graduate Center. He is an adjunct English instructor in the English department at Brooklyn College, and he'll be speaking about interdisciplinary approaches to teaching with science fiction.
Okay, hello everyone, thank you for being here. So as an instructor in the Brooklyn College English department who likes to use science fiction in my teaching, in my writing classes, in my literature classes, I've really started to rethink what that means and how we should go about teaching using science fiction, especially considering its interdisciplinary nature. So today I just want to talk a bit about some background on pedagogy with science fiction, and then also present just a few concrete examples. So, in the context of this conference and the present audience, it's probably unnecessary to provide an academic, clear justification for using science fiction in the classroom. However, let me begin by noting that simply among the genres that are once called popular or low, science fiction is probably the largest and the most read and probably the most intellectually stimulated. If as Darko Suvin has said, SF is the, quote, non-canonic repressed twin of literature. It is at least the literature that is actually read by a large swath of the public, right? Unlike many things we teach in our classrooms. So I think it's important. In its most fantastic forms and permutations, the basics of science fiction as a genre are, for the most part, implicitly understood by a broad spectrum of the public. Consumers of books, television, films, media, other kinds of media, what have you. So on a sociological level, it is really clear, the influence of science fiction on contemporary society cannot be understated, especially on the younger generation. Indeed, many teachers incorporating science fiction into their classrooms often do so simply to try and get more student engagement in their classes and in their material. Now, in considering college-age education, we should always be trying to introduce students to bodies of literature, certain genres that they are not familiar with. However, at the same time, we should be preparing them to be critical of the media they're encountering in their daily lives on a regular basis. I think that's very important. And science fiction is a large part of this. It's really become kind of touchstone of popular culture. Nowadays, many institutions of higher education do offer science fiction classes, like here at City Tech, obviously. However, for the most part, the instructors for these classes are still English or literature professors, myself included. I don't want to make any broad assumptions or generalizations here, but in general, these teachers are better at teaching literary matters like tropes and ideas and characterization and symbolism, narrative structure, plot formation, all these types of things, better than they are at teaching about technological implementation, technological change, science itself, and issues arising from these matters. So, in other words, English professors tend to place the emphasis on fiction in the term science fiction, right? For example, James Gunn, the noted science fiction writer and professor at the English department of the University of Kansas, identified 3 primary methods of teaching a science fiction class that is labeled as science fiction. So they are the great books method, the social issues method, and the history of the genre method. In general, most science fiction classes, in my experience, that are taught within English or humanities departments tend to fall under the great books model, in which there are generally some classics of the genre that the class discusses, maybe moves chronologically through the history of the genre. Focus on those books which are more literary in style, and then the class discusses the narrative structure, the themes, its relations with other texts, etc. For the students, classes of this kind generally follow a read, lecture, discuss, write sort of format. Now, it's not to say there's anything wrong, with this type of format or with this type of structure. However, Gunn himself notes the temptations and pitfalls that can arise from this kind of approach, in which, quote, the class discussion of a novel had to deal largely with novelistic rather than science fictional concerns. So, I think the separation that he draws between, on the one hand, novelistic concerns, and on the other, science fictional concerns is quite striking, because it does explicitly point out that they are not quite commensurate. They are not exactly the same. In other words, there is something about science fiction as a genre that really does distinguish it from other forms of literature, other kinds of literature, in which a novelistic or theory of the novel approach might be more appropriate. Now, this is not to say that the genre of science fiction cannot be approached in a literary manner. You can certainly compare it with other genres and see how it works, what's going on with it. In terms of a literary approach, we don't want to exoticize science fiction in that regard. But I do think taking an overly literary approach to science fiction really delimits or doesn't take advantage of the possibilities inherent in the genre itself. This is especially so considering that using science fiction to teach literary analysis is frankly redundant when, in English departments and humanities departments, there are already classes doing just that, using other forms of literature to teach literary exposition and, literary analysis. So, why use science fiction at that point? So, in part, this means we should also remember placing as much emphasis on the science as in the science fiction, as on the fiction. And of course, many educators do just that. Gary Ram, for instance, has done an excellent job showing in practical terms how science fiction can be used to teach scientific principles and procedures. It's in his book, Teaching Science Fact with Science Fiction. And while this book is mostly for high school students, it does have some useful material that I think translates well even into a college classroom. And it's generally true that because science fiction can be seen as an interloper or an outsider to the field of literature itself, instructors from other disciplines are more likely to use it, from the sciences or from engineering classes. They're more likely to use it to teach non-literary matters. However, this does not necessarily mean that we can or only should teach the hard sciences with SF or fiction or literary matters. Science or fiction are not our only options within science fiction. So what the almost paradoxical term science fiction itself, in its conjunction, really points out is exactly its inherently interdisciplinary nature. It is wide-ranging, border-defying, and ambiguous. And its power lies precisely in its ambiguity. So an alternative approach to teaching science fiction classes is to teach the class itself as an interdisciplinary subject, not a primarily literary one or a primarily scientific one. Again, this is based on the simple realization that science fiction crosses many boundaries, different academic trajectories, that sort of playfully imbues elements from all of them. It's kind of omnium gatherum that collects all sorts of knowledge from different areas, then recreates them into new guise. So keeping this incredible versatility in mind, an instructor should develop a course under the realization that, first and foremost, science fiction classes attract students of very diverse academic backgrounds, interests, and majors. Accordingly, the teacher should structure the curriculum such that it engages with a variety of student interests. But what's important here to recognize in a case like this is that the intent of the teacher here would change. They would no longer be teaching science fiction per se, they'd be teaching with science fiction, and that's an important distinction. So in other words, they're teaching a variety of subject matters using science fiction as a medium. They're not directly teaching science fiction itself, but they're utilizing science fiction to teach other things. Now, this does not mean a class should forego, the history, traditions, literary manifestations of science fiction itself. You can still analyze science fiction in such a class, it would still have its place. But by not sticking to a purely literary or purely scientific approach, you are being truer to the possibilities that are inherent in the genre itself. This might be a contentious or controversial statement, but if a science fiction class is to be conducted in the manner of a pure literature course, then why are you using science fiction at all? Right? There's really no reason or basis at that point to even use science fiction in the first place. So having a science fiction class, which is itself an inherently interdisciplinary subject, means focusing on aspects unique to science fiction. And again, what makes science fiction unique is precisely its ability to engage with many different intellectual domains at the same time. In short, seeing how the content of the class is interdisciplinary, the form of the class should also itself be interdisciplinary in nature. In its discussion and its assignments and its learning objectives. Otherwise, importing a sort of ready-made or external curricula brought in from traditional literature classes or traditional science classes, and then trying to impose that upon science fiction texts, it doesn't really do justice to the material. So, this is all well and good to say, but of course, begs the question of what such a class could actually look like in practice. And I don't want to be prescriptive here, but I do want to offer just a few basic suggestions and ideas for what the class could look like. So one of the first and best approaches, I think this is probably the most obvious one, would be to simply shake up traditional teaching methods and offer more instances of co-taught classes, which are still fairly rare. So a professor of computer science, for instance, could co-teach a science fiction class with a professor from the English department. Combining both their strengths, professors could create a space in which both English students and computer science engineering students would feel challenged and welcome at the same time. This would be using science fiction as a basis. They would still be analyzing popular ideas and imagination of culture, etc. But they would also learn the basics of computer programming at the same time. So if it can be done, such a dual focus design I think is very attractive. And it does deliver the interdisciplinary focus that many higher education institutions favor today. Again, it's true that these collaborative forms of teaching do happen, but they are still fairly rare, at least in my experience, and they're often viewed as kind of extra by universities. So, on the other hand, if you are just an English professor, say, all by your lonesome, there are still ways in which you can engage students other than just reading and writing, lecturing, and taking a purely literary approach. If you can't be on a team with another teacher, then at least you can have your students form teams themselves. So, I think a very fun, maybe it's a simple example, but a fun semester-long project in such a class can be, is that, each team of students would create, develop, and present their own science fiction world. So the prompt for this activity could be something as follows. So say, you are on a team of researchers sent by Earth to look into the possibilities of establishing diplomatic relations with a newly discovered alien world. Your job is to investigate the planet, produce a report summarizing your findings, suggesting a means for establishing diplomatic relations. So for this project, the end goal for each team would be a written report and an oral presentation. They could also do visualizations. They could use computer graphics to draw designs of what its inhabitants look like. The report itself would need to include an analysis of the actual physical details of the world, with, importantly, an emphasis on scientific and technological plausibility. In this regard, students would be required, for example, to research into physics, ecology, meteorology, and at the same time look into how technology itself develops, how technology is used to gather resources, what resources this planet can offer. In the process, students will learn how to creatively imagine how physical conditions in which we live actually affect our modes of living, and how scarcity or availability of resources could provide impetus for diplomatic relations, whether it be through trade or exploitation or what have you. So you'd see how needs drive technology and technological change, and vice versa, technology drives needs. And then you can see how both of these in turn drive politics itself. So through this sort of approach, it's a multimodal approach in which lots of different skills are being involved, and it begins with science and fiction, but ends far beyond either of those two terms taken by themselves, which I think is important. And this example is simple, but it does have the benefit of teaching with science fiction, using it to teach other matters, but also at the same time having students engage with science fiction itself, because they're thinking like a science fiction writer at that point, preparing a story. So in general, the goal in using science fiction is that we want to break the student misconception that each class is kind of a singular, closed event that has no relation to the other classes they are taking. We want to foster interconnections in their learning and get them to think more holistically about the subjects that they are engaging with. And so just lastly, since we were talking about Science Fiction Symposium, or the collection here, I just wanted to show a personal project of mine that involves the collection here. It's meant as kind of a companion piece for the Open Lab that Jason has set up. So basically, this is specifically for teachers who would want to find or use resources in the archive and be able to share teaching lessons, plans, activities, all these sorts of things. So it's still very rudimentary at this point. It's still very basic. However, I just want to share a few examples of what I think we could talk about as far as interdisciplinary teaching goes. So the way it's set up currently with the teaching resources, I have a description, learning objectives, an assessment, and then some actual examples of how each lesson could go. And I also show in what departments or what academic disciplines it could best be used. So the first example is quite simple. It's just interpreting images, but I think it could be used in lots of different domains, in history, sociology, media studies, all this sort of stuff. So students would go to the archive, They would dig around, try to find something interesting, and then they would provide an analysis of the images that they find. So just as an example here, hopefully everyone can see this, it's a little bit small. But so this is something I found in the, I think it was 1958 analog, no, 1953, sorry, 1953 edition of analog. There's two different advertisements. One on the left-hand side is for the Commercial Trades Institute of Chicago, and it's advocating for learning a very practical profession, refrigeration and air conditioning. So it's very practical. Come here, you'll get a better job, you can have a career, have a better life. On the other hand, right juxtaposed to it on the right side, we have an advertisement for the Rosicrucian Order, which if you know what the Rosicrucian Order is, it's very esoteric. They believe there's some kind of metaphysical order to the universe that you have, you can gain access to, you can gain knowledge to. So I think, just the pure juxtaposition of the utter practicality of, on the one hand, get in with refrigerators, do some air conditioning repair, and on the other side, on the right beside it, is, oh, hey, get our book. We'll show you the underlying truths of the universe itself. So, in this juxtaposition, I think there could be a lot said. A student could look at this and, research into both of these institutions and, analyze their juxtaposition, which I think would be really interesting and fruitful. So that's one example. Another is just simply to look at the covers of the magazines. So this is a series of analog. It's from January to April in 1968. And I apologize, the pictures are not the best. But you can see, even without looking into the editions themselves, a student just looking at the images could provide lots of interesting discussion on what science fiction as a genre is. So we have space, we have land, we have ocean. There's a barbarian riding a chimerical-looking horse. There's this sort of capitalist-looking alien smoking a cigarette. All of these sort of interesting juxtapositions are again fruitful for understanding the versatility, the flexibility, and the sheer wide-ranging scope of what science fiction as a genre is. And this is just by looking at the covers, just by looking at the images and thinking critically about what images themselves tell you. So again, that's more humanities-oriented example, but I'd like to show one more. So if we're thinking, again, to return to perhaps combining computer science with more humanities-based discussions using science fiction, I've created just a short example here in which students would create a choose-your-own-adventure story or interactive fictional story using something they find in the archive. So they would visit the archive, they would find a short story or an image that they could turn into a short story, and they would write it up, and then they would think about how to turn that into a piece of interactive fiction. So what this would involve is using, my example here uses C++, which is a very important, it's a difficult language, but it's a very important language to learn for computer science students. So I have here, if you were a teacher and wanted to use this, I have fully commented code, everything laid out exactly as the program would go that you could use for your students. And then an actual example. And I know Kafka is not a very good example of science fiction, but is the book I had on hand when I was doing this. So it's just a short story by Franz Kafka that is turned into a piece of interactive fiction. And it's very simple. It outputs right to the console window. There's no need for any secondary software other than the compiler itself. So you can just see, asks you to type your name, type in your name, then it shows you the short story, and it gives you down below the two options you have. And you could add more if you'd like. Enter 1 to choose one direction, enter 2 to choose another, and then it proceeds based on the choice. So this is something that students in an English class even could do. And you could turn in this instead of a paper. You could turn in an executable file, a program, instead of a more traditional route, which is to turn in the paper, which I think is actually really interesting and could be very useful for lots of students engaging lots of different intellectual trajectories. So in closing, I'd like to say, science fiction at its heart is always about breaking boundaries. So in our teaching, I think we should be striving to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. Yeah.
Elephant in the room, forgive me if this is perpetuating prejudices, but in my outdated experience, most English teachers really did hold science fiction in contempt. If they have to teach something they dislike, how well is that going to work out? Is there a workaround? fair, probably there's, just like in the other direction, that a few science teachers have a proper appreciation of literature. So how do you bridge that gap? I mean, obviously, everyone here is an exception, but this is not the whole world.
Well, I guess I can respond a little bit to that. One of the things, at least here at City Tech, and I think it's true most places, you teach the classes that you're most interested in. You're not assigned necessarily like you have to teach science fiction. Those that are self-selected to want to teach science fiction would be the ones teaching it. So there's that. But one of the things that Zach had brought up about co-teaching classes is something that is institutionalized here at City Tech, in which students through all the four-year degree programs have to get what's called an interdisciplinary class. This is a normal class that's co-taught or team taught that has an ID designation to it. And I haven't personally taught these classes, but my colleague Alan, who's not here anymore, did. And he worked with a faculty member in the physics department, and they would have meetings where Alan would choose stories that would supplement some of the physical concepts that his co-teacher was most familiar with or would want to engage in during his sessions of the class. And so it was much like my example with using any build a crooked house in mathematical, where the ideas of the story are then explored in a factual or in a hands-on kind of manner, and when the physics professor would teach the following class after they would discuss the story. Students here at City Tech, I mean, they since they're required to take those classes, they register for them immediately, and so there's a lot of energy in those classes. They're always filled up. So I think maybe that is part of the way, but just to kind of problematize it a little bit, there's also labor issues involved, the way that we get credit for teaching these co-taught classes. There's more labor involved in the planning, because if you design your own class, you're god of that domain, it's relatively easy. But when you're having to work with someone else, then it's a collaboration. So there are extra time that goes into the planning and implementation in order to make it work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank both of you. This is really great. And in particular, Zach, I actually do co-teach a class with a computer scientist. We do artificial intelligence and science fiction. And I'd let you know that much as Jason says, it's a tremendous amount of work. It's really twice as much work to co-teach a class rather than half the work, because you have to learn each other's disciplines. Mm-hmm. And that's critical. Otherwise, the class utterly falls apart, because the students can smell it from a mile away. If one of the professors is bored, they're like, yeah, you're out. So are we. So it's interesting. You learn a lot from doing it that way, for sure. The class turns out interesting, kind of weird. And just to give you a sense of the assignments we did, because I kind of like the ones you were talking about, we had them write a science fiction story, program an AI, and then program an AI to write a science fiction story. And if you've ever seen the movie Sunstorm, you know AIs cannot write stories to save their lives.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks. Yeah, I like some of your ideas, so we'll have to try some of those in the future.
Other questions? So maybe,
For Zach, do you get any pushback from students about the use of the code, or is this more of an option for students who would prefer not to write a paper, as you said, who would enjoy some non-writing type of final assignment?
It's usually an option. It's usually an option at this point. And I don't have as much flexibility at Brooklyn College as I would like sometimes. So it does have to be usually an option. But I do have a lot of computer science students who really jump on it a lot, or people who just want to learn programming, just the fundamentals, the basics. Again, it's not very complicated, but working with those students is, I think, pretty rewarding, and they do seem to enjoy it. But again, they can be free to write in a more traditional manner if they would like as well. I try and pair both of them when I get the opportunity to.
one more question over here.
Yeah, I'm curious about the economics of co-teaching. It seems to me, I teach for medical school, but it seems to me that the universities have really been cutting corners and hiring adjuncts. Would this create more job opportunities for adjuncts, or would the universities just cheap out?
I guess just in general, thinking about like the situation at City Tech, with you know, obviously with adjunct labor, it would be a way of cutting corners. It would be reducing costs. But I don't think that that's you know, obviously a positive thing, because it does require more work to do this kind of teaching, to do that kind of planning. And for an adjunct who's already being paid less, to be expected to do more work for the same, essentially, work that they would have been doing before in a regular class is grossly unfair. I don't know what the future might hold for this. And as I said, I haven't had a chance to teach an ID class yet, partly because just the labor issues as a full-time faculty member, as seeing that there's an unfairness there in terms of like how you're paid for you're doing that kind of teaching and planning and the extra work that's involved. I would hope that adjuncts aren't going to be another scapegoat for like implementation of these kinds of plans. While certainly adjuncts coming in are going to provide a wealth of knowledge and experience for those classes, they should be justly rewarded for that effort as well.
All right, well, why don't we give a round of applause to our two